And so, with that, today I am going to be talking to you about the power of storytelling, human stories in a digital world. It takes one person to make a difference. One story, one story that can change the trajectory of your career, your ambition, and your life. It's one story that you can tell that changes the trajectory of someone else's career, ambition, or life. And I'm going to tell you first the story that changed my life. I came into tech after I went through trauma. When I had my fourth child, two of my organs ruptured into each other. And I kept telling the doctors that there was something wrong. And I had all of these awful symptoms, but they didn't believe me and they told me I was fine. And they sent me home. A week later, I went in to see my OBGYN. And I remember sitting there in that hospital bed. And she told me, "You're not my problem." And I never felt so hopeless in my life. A month later, after fighting doctors and tests and trying to get someone to diagnose me, I finally had surgery. And during that experience, I accidentally overdosed on morphine and I had to be Narcaned, which is not ideal. But I went home with PTSD that was undiagnosed, anxiety. I had my first panic attack when I went home, and depression. And I felt alone. Like no one could possibly understand what I was going through. And after all, less than 1% of the population who had had babies experienced the same thing. So it was reasonable to believe that nobody else understood. And in the midst of all of this, about a year later, my husband, who was a second career developer, said, "Hey, you should learn how to code." And I just thought, this doesn't make any sense. But he was really persistent in that. And so, fine. I will try free code camp and then you can stop bothering me about it. But here's the thing. When I started to code, the moment I started writing HTML, the cycling trauma that was in my head all the time, every day, repeating, it stopped. And that was the first break I had, the first moments of fresh air that I could breathe in where I could feel like I was myself, that I could remember who I was. And so coding became therapy, and then it became community, and finally it became a career change. And I didn't forget the experience that got me to this point. In fact, it's the thing that's driven my goals and my purpose in tech. My primary goal is to connect others so no one feels as alone as I did in that hospital office when I was labeled as somebody else's problem. But that's not the story that changed my life. I received a full scholarship to Flatiron School boot camp, and I met with my educational coach, Katie McKenna. She had run my scholarship essay that got me to that point, and in one of our first meetings, she said, "Bekah, I went through a trauma too. Do you mind if I share that experience with you?" Katie had been run over by a semi truck. And not only did she defy the odds by surviving, she defied them by walking again. And in the last year, she defied them one more time when she had her daughter and made it through pregnancy. But in that moment, when Katie shared her story with me, I didn't feel alone for the first time in a really long time. She said things that I had said to myself that I thought nobody else thought. And a couple of weeks later, I told her I was writing the story of everything that I had gone through, but I wasn't really sure why. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I torturing myself to write through this again? And she said, "Bekah, we don't share our stories for ourselves. We share them to invite other people to share theirs with us." And that's the story that changed my life. And so why am I telling you this right here today? Well, the connections that we find through sharing stories is often forgotten, deprioritized, or thought of as frivolous. But I think that it's more important than ever. The connection with Katie, it wasn't purely an emotional connection, it was a physiological connection. According to Ted Bauer in the neuroscience of storytelling, when we see or hear a story, The neurons in our brains fire in the same patterns as the speakers, and we call this neural coupling. So, in other words, when we listen to something that we relate to, something that we get excited about, somebody else's stories, our brains start to form patterns to make it like the other person's brains, like the speaker's brains, so we can understand the meanings and connect to their world. What happens in those moments? Well, we're more likely to open up and feel vulnerable. Now, if we look at this from a neuroscience perspective, let me see if I can get my slides to advance. Here we go. If we look at this from a neuroscience perspective, storytelling is effective for a couple of different reasons. We are hardwired for storytelling. Our brains light up when we hear stories. It creates connections that allow us to remember those connections. It activates our brains when we relate. Along with that, our bodies produce the neurochemical oxytocin. And this goes back to what Gant was telling us when we were talking about learning how to speak and engaging in that for the first time. When we hear stories that we connect to, our bodies produce oxytocin. This allows us to bond to others, to feel love, to be connected. And according to Paul J. Zak, oxytocin is produced when we are trusted or shown a kindness. And what does that do? It motivates us to cooperate with other people. It does this by enhancing our sense of empathy and our ability to experience other people's emotions. This connection and motivation is so empowering. It does this it does this, and we are empowered to trust others, to take risks, to be transparent, and to grow. And when we feel comfortable doing that, we're more likely to be supportive collaborators and to innovate in those moments. We're more likely to take risks and to do big and great things. But beyond that, our brains work to connect stories to help us to remember them. A part of the brain that's called the hippocampus helps us to weave the narrative of the disjointed stories that make up our lives, which allows us to connect to them even more. So what this means is most of our lives are not narratives. They don't follow a straightforward plot line, right? Like we learn in school. There's a way that the characters go through the ordinary world and then they make progress, and then there's a climax of that progress and things fall, and then there's a resolution. Our lives are often not like that plot line. But our brains make the connections for us to help us to remember those things. So our brains are doing these things that we call, that Kohn Sheehy calls narrative memories. It connects our memories so we're better able to remember those events. So it should be no surprise to us that storytelling helps us to connect to our audience. Storytelling at its core is about sharing our experience, our knowledge, the things that have inspired us. So if your story isn't complete, if it's not linear, if there's no plot line to follow, don't worry. Our hormones and our brains are there to connect us to the people who are in our lives. It's probably not a surprise to any of us that studies indicate there's been increased loneliness during the pandemic. So tell me in the chat if this sounds familiar. You jump into meeting after meeting that's read off of an agenda, or you jump straight into work. And then we might have company-wide social events if we're lucky, but we opt out of those because there's too much to do, or we're too tired, or we're too burnt out. We prioritize productivity over connection. In other words, we're losing our opportunities to connect with others in meaningful ways. But humans are made to connect to each other. And we do that through storytelling. So how do we get started? Well, we start by telling stories that build trust. According to the article, Make Us React, the Neuroscience of Narrative, If You Treat Me Well. In most cases, my brain will synthesize oxytocin and will motivate me to treat you well in return. And along with that, it creates a sense of trustworthiness in the other person. When we don't get that, it impacts our work environment. One of the simplest ways to connect through storytelling is missing in our everyday experiences. It leads us to feel more isolated in our work, and that contributes to burnout. Storytelling humanizes us. We're not another coworker, a support person, a cog in the wheel. Storytelling allows us to see each other as complex human beings, and it often helps us to connect to others that we see as different than us. When we see each other as complex human beings, we're more likely to approach each other with openness and empathy. And this is ideal for working together. This is what we want, to navigate conflicts, to come to an understanding when you disagree with someone else. So, how do we build storytelling into our daily interactions? Well, within a company, storytelling allows for a shared understanding of the mission, the key priorities, clarity of the creation process. It allows us to help new employees to be onboarded and to establish a culture of innovation through storytelling. How do you connect to your company or your team? There are all of these opportunities to use storytelling to establish that company culture and to build trust. So, for example, storytelling increases effectiveness in mentoring relationships as well as transferring knowledge in the workplace, according to Dorothy Leonard. So, we can do this often through mentoring. What makes a good mentor is someone who's willing to be open and vulnerable and knowledgeable. If there's documentation, anybody can find the answer in documentation, but that doesn't mean that they connect to it or they understand it in the context of the organization. That comes through the mentor. Tell your story of being part of the organization, your story and the historical knowledge that comes with that. What do you know about the people? What do you know about the team? How does that all work together? This becomes an opportunity to share a part of you, to connect to your mentee, and to recognize the coworkers who have made an impact in your life. Tell those stories. Who are the people that are there that have impacted you? In doing so, you help your mentee to recognize and to remember who to trust and who you find impactful, which also leads them to find that person trustworthy and impactful. So when we do this, we start to build a strong culture. So, why is storytelling important in a digital world? Why is it important to us today in tech right now? We have the space to make connections, but we have to make the time. It's about connecting ourselves to our families, our friends, our teammates, and other people in the company. If you have a task and you automate it, take the time that you would have used for that task and invest in the people instead of doing another task. It's about telling the story of how we founded a company, of the mistakes that we've made, how we've learned. It's about growing together. It's about connecting even when it's hard to connect to others. We need storytelling in our life. We need it to connect, to learn, for psychological safety, to empathize with the struggles of others, so we can feel excited when other people succeed and overcome adversity. So what if we started learning about each other before we ever gave each other a list of tasks to be completed? What if we started our conversations with a new person without mentioning our jobs or what we do for a living? What if we listen to customers and the stories of their struggles and we choose empathy? What if we connect to a time that we have struggled and then better understand what they're going through as well? So I have a challenge to everyone here today. Make one connection. Share a story with someone you don't know, or maybe you only know a little bit, and then take the time to listen to their stories too.